The company spent $2.8 million making the old grain elevator look new. New sensors, new paint, new steel braces, new computer panels, new safety reports printed on thick paper, signed by people with degrees Harold Bennett never claimed to have. But the part that mattered most was still from 1938, and nobody wanted to say that out loud. Not the engineers, not the plant manager, not the county officials who had stood in front of the town promising jobs, progress, and a fresh start. Not even Harold's own daughter, who worked in the office and begged him not to embarrass her on reopening day. To them, Harold was just an old mechanic who couldn't accept that the world had moved on. Then the first grain truck backed up to the dump pit. Under the motors, under the polished noise of all that expensive progress, Harold heard it. A tiny skip, a metal tooth missing its place. The kind of sound no sensor respected, because no sensor had lived long enough to know what it meant. Harold stepped toward the gate and said, "Shut it down." The manager smiled, like Harold was a child. Then the west wall trembled. If stories about forgotten people, old promises, and old skills, the world was too quick to replace, mean something to you, consider subscribing. Because what happened at that grain elevator was not just about an old man, a broken gear, or a town desperate for jobs. It was about the kind of truth that waits quietly inside a machine until someone finally listens. By 9 o'clock that morning, Prairie Crown Grain Elevator looked better than it had in 30 years. The tower stood at the edge of the county road, tall and freshly painted against the pale Iowa sky. Its white siding was bright enough to hide the rust stains near the seams. A red, white, and blue ribbon stretched across the main gate. Folding chairs had been lined up on the gravel. A local news van waited beside the scale house. Men in clean boots and company jackets shook hands like the hard part was already over. For months, the town had been told the same thing. The elevator was coming back. The jobs were coming back. The harvest trucks would no longer have to drive 40 miles to the next county. Young men who had left for warehouse work might come home. Farmers who had watched the old tower sit silent for years might finally see grain moving through it again. That was why nobody wanted trouble that morning. Especially not from Harold Bennett. He stood just outside the chain-link fence in a brown work coat gone shiny at the elbows. His cap sat low over his forehead. His stiff hands rested on the top of his cane, though anyone who knew him understood the cane was more for balance than surrender. At 79, Harold still had the frame of a man who had spent his life lifting things too heavy and standing too long on concrete floors. His back bent a little when he walked. His left shoulder never rose quite as high as the right one anymore. But his eyes had not gone soft. They moved over the elevator slowly, not admiring the paint, listening. Emily Bennett saw him from the office steps and felt her stomach tighten. She had asked him not to come early. She had asked him not to wander near the operating yard. She had asked him, gently at first and then not so gently, to let this day happen without turning it into another argument about the past. "Dad," she said, crossing the gravel toward him, keeping her voice low. "Please. Not today." Harold did not look at her right away. The elevator motor hummed through the morning air. Somewhere inside the structure, belts began moving in rehearsal for the ceremony. A clean mechanical vibration rolled through the siding, smooth enough that most people would have called it healthy. Harold listened beneath it. "I'm not here to make trouble," he said. Emily glanced toward the chairs, where county officials were beginning to take their seats. "You say that every time." That hurt him. He did not show it. Emily was 46, tired in the way people get tired when they have spent years holding two lives together. She had worked payroll at a feed supplier before the company bought Prairie Crown and offered her a front office job. It was the first steady work she had found in almost a year. Health insurance, regular hours, a desk by a window. Harold knew what that meant to her. He knew what it meant to make rent without counting every grocery item twice. And still, his eyes stayed on the elevator. Mark Delaney, the plant manager, came out from the scale house wearing a navy blazer over his company shirt. The blazer was too formal for a grain yard, but this was not an ordinary morning. Cameras were here. Commissioner Wade Pike was here. Investors were watching. Every handshake mattered. Mark saw Harold and forced a smile. "Mr. Bennett," he called. "Didn't expect to see you inside the fence this morning." "I'm not inside the fence," Harold said. Mark's smile thinned. "Let's keep it that way." Emily closed her eyes for half a second. Trevor Hall, the young engineer overseeing the control system, stepped out behind Mark with a tablet in one hand. He was neat, confident, and young enough that Harold's lifetime of repair work looked to him like something from a museum display. "Everything's reading clean," Trevor said, though nobody had asked him yet. "We ran diagnostics twice before sunrise." Harold finally turned his head. "Diagnostics won't hear what I hear." Trevor gave a small laugh. Not loud enough to be openly cruel, loud enough for nearby workers to hear. A couple of them looked over. One smiled. That was how these things started. Not with a shout, not with a fight, just one small public smile that told everyone which side was safe to stand on. Emily stepped closer to her father. "Dad, please don't." Then the first grain truck rolled into the yard. Its brakes hissed as it backed toward the dump pit. The driver leaned out the window, following hand signals from a worker in an orange vest. Cameras shifted. Commissioner Pike straightened his tie. Mark Delaney clapped once and told everyone this was the first demonstration load. The elevator motors deepened. A low vibration traveled under the gravel. Harold's fingers tightened on the cane. There it was again. Not loud. Not dramatic. A break in the rhythm so small a man could miss it if he was listening for noise instead of pattern. Skip. Catch. Pull. Skip. Harold took one step toward the gate. Emily grabbed his sleeve. "No. That lower drive is slipping under load." "Dad, you don't know that." He looked at her hand on his coat. "Yes, I do." Trevor heard him and sighed. "The lower drive assembly is within tolerance. We inspected it. The load simulation passed. The vibration sensors are green." Harold pointed toward the base of the tower. "Your sensors are mounted on the frame. The slip is inside the old gear housing." Trevor's expression cooled. The 1,938 component was evaluated. Evaluated isn't replaced. Mark stepped between them. "Mr. Bennett, this is not the time." "That's exactly what makes it the time." The worker at the dump pit raised his hand. The truck bed began to lift. Grain slid backward with a dry, heavy rush, pouring toward the grate. Corn against steel, harvest becoming business. A town telling itself it was alive again. Then Harold heard the tooth miss. This time, the sound came with a tremor. The west wall shivered once, so lightly that several people thought it was the truck settling. Harold did not. He pushed through the gate. Mark caught his arm. "You are not authorized to enter the operating area." Harold's voice stayed low. "Shut it down." Trevor stepped closer, face flushed. "You cannot walk into an active industrial site because you think you heard something." "I don't think." A few people laughed. Not many. Just enough. Emily's face burned. "Dad." Harold looked past all of them toward the lower drive room door. It was painted gray now. New lock, new sign, new warning label. But in his mind, he saw it the way it used to be. Oiled dark, hot in summer. Cold enough in January to numb your fingers before the first bolt came loose. He saw his father crouched beside the gear housing with a rag in one hand and a brass gauge in the other. "Machines tell you before they fail, son. But only if you give them the courtesy of listening." The truck bed rose higher. The grain flow thickened. The tower took the weight. And under the motors, under the smiles, under the smooth digital confidence of a $2.8 million renovation, the old gear skipped again. This time, the safety cable near the dump pit snapped tight and began to tremble in the wrong rhythm. Harold saw it. So did one young worker standing beside the grate. The worker's smile disappeared. Harold pulled his arm free from Mark's grip and stepped toward the emergency stop. "Either you shut it down," he said, "or I will." For the first time that morning, nobody laughed. Long before Harold Bennett stood in front of the reopened grain elevator and told them to shut it down, he had been a boy small enough to walk beneath the grain chutes without lowering his head. Back then, Prairie Crown was not a renovation project, a county promise, or a line in a development speech. It was the tallest thing Harold knew. In harvest season, trucks waited before sunrise with their headlights glowing through dust. Farmers drank coffee from dented thermoses. Men came home with corn powder on their sleeves and diesel in their clothes. The whole town seemed to breathe through that elevator. Harold's father, Charles Bennett, worked maintenance there for 34 years. Charles was not the kind of man who impressed strangers quickly. He did not talk loudly. He did not dress like a man with authority. His shirts were usually stained at the cuffs. His hands were scarred across the knuckles, and his lunch pail looked older than some of the men who worked under him. But around machinery, people listened to him. Charles had a rule Harold never forgot. Before touching a wrench, you listened. When Harold was 9, he saw his father press one palm against a steel railing and close his eyes while the elevator ran above them. Harold thought he was praying. "What are you doing?" the boy asked. Charles opened one eye and gave him the smallest smile, letting the machine finish its sentence. That was the first time Harold understood that machines did not fail in silence. They warned you first. A dry bearing whispered before it screamed. A belt out of line developed a nervous flap. A chain under wrong tension chattered like teeth in winter. A gear carrying too much load skipped in a way most men never noticed, because they were listening for a crash instead of a pattern. Charles taught Harold to hear those patterns. Not from books, not from charts. From mornings spent in the lower drive room, where the air smelled of grease, old grain, and warm metal. From afternoons standing beside conveyor housings while the building shook around them. From nights when a farmer needed one more load moved before rain, and Charles stayed until the machine sounded right again. "Any fool can tighten a bolt," Charles would say. "A mechanic knows why it loosened." By the time Harold was 16, he could tell when the leg was carrying corn instead of wheat. By 19, he could hear when a pulley was fighting its own belt. By his 20s, he was working beside his father and beginning to understand that Charles was not just repairing machines, he was protecting people who trusted them. Then came 1976. That year, Prairie Crown pushed more grain than it had ever handled before. 2 smaller elevators in nearby towns had closed, and trucks came in from miles away. The owners called it a good season. The office called it growth. Farmers called it relief. Charles called it too much load. Harold remembered the night his father first heard it clearly. Rain tapped against the metal siding. The last truck had gone. The yard lights turned puddles yellow. Charles came out of the lower drive room holding his brass tooth gauge, his face quiet in a way that made Harold uneasy. The next morning, Charles filed a maintenance complaint. He wrote that the old lower drive gear, the one installed in 1938, was carrying stress it had never been designed for. He recommended shutting the elevator down long enough to replace the assembly. He wrote that a patch or adjustment would not be enough if the company planned to keep increasing load. For 3 days, men talked about it. Some agreed with him in corners. Some looked away. Most said nothing where it mattered. The company had a major grain contract that fall. Shutting down meant lost money, angry farmers, delayed shipments, and men sent home before winter. Nobody wanted to be the reason the season stopped. Nobody wanted to be the person who said Charles Bennett was right, if being right cost everyone something. By the following week, the complaint was gone from the board. By the end of the month, Charles had been moved off lead maintenance. By winter, he was no longer working at Prairie Crown. No one called it punishment. They never did when they wanted the record clean. They called it restructuring. They said Charles had become difficult. They said he worried too much. They said old mechanics sometimes heard problems that were not there. Harold hated that phrase most of all. Problems that were not there. Because he had heard the skip too. Not as clearly as his father, but enough to know Charles had not imagined it. Enough to know the machine had spoken, and the people in charge had chosen not to listen. Charles came home with the brass gauge in his lunch pail and put it in the top drawer of his workbench. After that, he took repair jobs wherever he could find them. Tractors, feed mixers, a church furnace, a hay elevator that paid almost nothing but needed saving before winter. He did not complain much. That made it worse. A loud wound can be argued with. A quiet wound settles into a house. It sits at the dinner table. It follows a man into the yard when the elevator starts up in the distance. It makes him pause with a coffee cup in his hand, listening toward the tower that no longer wants his name spoken inside it. Harold watched his father become smaller in the eyes of the town, not because Charles knew less, because he had warned them before they were ready to hear it. Years later, when Charles died, Harold found the brass tooth gauge still wrapped in an old oilcloth. He took it home and placed it in his own drawer. He never told Emily the whole story, not properly. When Emily was young, she only heard pieces. Her grandfather had lost his job. Her father distrusted the elevator company. Men in town avoided certain subjects around the Bennetts. At supper, Harold's wife would sometimes touch his wrist and say, "Not tonight," when his anger got too close to the surface. So Emily grew up believing Prairie Crown was a place her father could not let go of. To her, the elevator was not a warning. It was a shadow. And when the new company reopened it decades later and offered her an office job, she saw a chance to step out of that shadow. A steady paycheck, health insurance, a desk by a window, a future that did not have to keep apologizing for an old wound. Harold understood that. That was why he had tried to stay away. But on the morning of the reopening, before he left his house, he opened the drawer beside his bed and took out the brass tooth gauge. He held it in his palm for a long moment, feeling the worn edge where his father's thumb had rested all those years ago. Then, he slipped it into his coat pocket. Not because he wanted a fight, because some promises are never spoken out loud, and when he reached Prairie Crown, when the motors started, and the crowd smiled and the first truck backed toward the pit, Harold did not hear a new beginning. He heard 1,976. He heard his father's warning. He heard the same unfinished sentence buried beneath new paint, new sensors, and new confidence. And that was why, before anyone else understood what the old grain elevator was really hiding, Harold Bennett turned his attention to the one piece everyone had dismissed as harmless: the lower drive gear from 1938. From the road, Prairie Crown Grain Elevator looked like proof that the town still had a future. Fresh white siding caught the morning light. The company logo had been repainted in blue across the upper wall. New steel braces ran along the outside frame. The scale house windows had been replaced. The control room had a digital panel behind glass. Even the gravel had been leveled so the yard looked less like an old worksite and more like a promise. That was what the company wanted people to see. To Commissioner Wade Pike, it was perfect. It photographed well. It sounded good in speeches. It gave the town something hopeful without forcing anyone to ask what had been covered, sealed, painted over, or simply left where it had always been. But Harold Bennett had never trusted a machine from the road. A machine's truth lived where visitors did not look. Behind guards, under housings, around old bolts, in oil that ran too dark, in dust that gathered where vibration pushed it loose, in the places where new paint tried to make old metal look forgiven. And at Prairie Crown, the truth lived in the lower drive room. That was where the 1,938 gear still sat. The company did not mention it in the ribbon-cutting speech. It was not in the newspaper story about new jobs. It was not in the renovation flyer that called the elevator a blend of historic character and modern reliability. In the paperwork, it had a clean name: Existing Lower Drive Assembly Retained After Inspection. Trevor Hall had used an even cleaner phrase when Emily once showed Harold the documents at her kitchen table. Legacy component. Harold remembered almost laughing at that. Legacy component made the gear sound harmless. Like an old sign kept for charm. Like original brick left in a lobby. Like something preserved because it looked good, not because the whole building still depended on it. But the lower drive gear was not decoration. It was the piece that received force after the motors started sending power through the system. It helped transfer motion into the belts, cups, shafts, and pulleys that lifted grain through the tower. If the gear accepted the load cleanly, the elevator worked. If it did not, every new sensor and new brace became a polished shell around a failing heart. That was the part no one wanted Harold to say out loud. The lower drive room sat near the base of the tower, behind a gray steel door with a new warning sign bolted to it. Authorized personnel only. Hearing protection required. Lockout procedure mandatory. The sign was bright, modern, and official. The door behind it was older than most of the men guarding it. Harold had not been inside since the renovation, but he still knew the room by memory. He knew where the floor dipped near the drain channel. He knew how the left wall sweated in winter. He knew the cast iron housing sat low beside the service platform, heavy and stubborn, like something buried but not dead. While the ceremony gathered outside, Trevor stayed near the control room with his tablet. Every few minutes, he glanced down and nodded, as if numbers could settle every question. Frame vibration is stable, he told Mark Delaney. Mark looked relieved. Emily stood nearby with a clipboard pressed to her chest, though her eyes kept returning to Harold near the gate. Harold was not watching the crowd anymore. He was watching the building respond. When the motors started, the new braces carried a clean hum. That was what everyone else heard. Harold kept his attention lower, near the base, where the old drive system had to accept the first pull of real weight. He saw small things: a safety cable trembling out of rhythm, a faint pulse through the service guard, a vibration that came and went too quickly, like a man hiding a limp when he knew someone was watching. Then Caleb Morse walked past with a coil of extension cord. He was young, maybe 24, with nervous hands and the cautious walk of someone still trying to prove he belonged. "You worked here before?" Caleb asked. "Long time ago," Harold said. "My granddad said, this place used to shake so hard you could feel it in the diner windows." "It still shakes," Harold said. "Question is whether it shakes right." Caleb gave a small, uncertain smile. He did not laugh, but he did not fully understand either. Harold let it go. Then the first load began moving through the system. Grain slid into the pit, lifted upward, and entered the flow the company had promised was tested, certified, and ready. For a few seconds, everything seemed fine. Trevor watched his tablet. Mark watched the crowd. Commissioner Pike watched the news camera. Emily watched Harold. Harold watched the lower drive room door. That was when he saw the bolt. It sat near the edge of the service guard, visible through the mesh when the sunlight hit at the right angle. New. Too clean. Too bright. Surrounded by older metal that had been painted over instead of stripped down. One new bolt did not prove anything. But inside an old machine, one clean part among dirty ones was like one fresh word in an old lie. The guard trembled again. A thin line of dust fell from the seam beneath the lower siding. To anyone else, it was just dirt. To Harold, it meant movement, where movement should not be. He slipped one hand into his coat pocket and touched the brass tooth gauge. He did not take it out. There was no use showing a tool to men who had already decided it belonged to another century. Trevor came down from the control platform. "Mr. Bennett," he said, keeping his voice professional. "If you're concerned, we can explain the inspection process after the demonstration." Harold looked at him. After is the wrong time. The assembly passed inspection. Surface inspection. Trevor paused. Only half a second. But Harold heard pauses too. He nodded toward the lower room. "Did anyone rotate it under load with the cover open?" "We followed approved procedure." "That isn't what I asked." Mark Delaney moved toward them quickly, smiling for the crowd while his eyes warned Harold not to continue. Emily stepped in beside him, her voice low and strained. "Dad, don't do this here." Harold looked at his daughter, then at the tower, then at the safety cable trembling in the wrong rhythm. For one painful second, he almost listened to her. Then the grain flow thickened. The lower housing took another pull, and beneath the motors Harold heard the gear skip again. Not loudly. Not enough for the crowd. But enough. He turned to Mark. "Open the lower drive room," Harold said, "before the next load goes through." Mark's smile disappeared. And in that moment, the argument stopped being about whether Harold had heard something. It became about whether anyone in charge was willing to admit that the old man without a badge might understand the elevator better than the people paid to certify it. That refusal would lead directly to the first real confrontation, because Harold was about to learn that hearing the truth was one thing. Getting powerful men to stop a ceremony for it was something else entirely. Mark Delaney did not answer Harold right away. He looked first at the crowd. That told Harold almost everything. A man who was truly worried about safety looked toward the machine. A man worried about embarrassment looked toward the chairs, the cameras, the commissioner, and the visitors holding paper cups of coffee beside the scale house. Mark's smile came back slowly, but it had gone stiff at the edges. "Mr. Bennett," he said, keeping his voice low, "we are in the middle of a scheduled demonstration. That's why I'm telling you now. The lower drive room is a restricted area. Then send someone authorized." Mark glanced toward Trevor, as if asking the young engineer to end this cleanly. Trevor stepped forward with his tablet already raised. "The system is operating within approved parameters," he said. "Frame vibration is normal. Motor temperature is normal. Belt speed is normal. Load transfer is consistent with the simulation." Harold looked at the screen without interest. "You're measuring the frame." Trevor blinked. "That is where vibration monitoring is mounted." "I know where it's mounted." "Then you understand the readings are stable." "No," Harold said. "I understand what they're missing." That was when the first laugh came. It came from a man near the back of the demonstration crew, not loud, not cruel enough for anyone to condemn, but careless enough to give permission to others. A few people shifted. Someone muttered something about old-timers. Another man said, "Next he'll want us to smell the bolts." Trevor did not laugh, but he did not stop it either. That stung more than if he had joined in. Emily stepped between them, before the sound could grow. "Dad," she said, forcing a small smile for anyone watching, "come talk to me for a second." Harold kept his eyes on Mark. "Open the room." "Dad." Her voice changed then. It lost the public softness and became the voice she used when she was trying not to cry in anger. Harold looked at her. Emily's cheeks were red. One hand gripped the clipboard so tightly the paper bent beneath her fingers. "Please," she whispered. "You are doing exactly what I begged you not to do. I'm trying to keep them from running another load. You're humiliating me." The words hit harder than Mark's hand on his arm had. For a moment, the yard noise faded. Harold saw his daughter not as a grown woman in an office blouse, but as a child at the kitchen table, listening to adults talk around things they could not explain to her. He saw all the years she had spent carrying a family wound she had never been given in full. "I'm not trying to hurt you," he said. "Then stop." "I can't." Her eyes filled with disbelief. Behind them, Commissioner Wade Pike had left his seat and was speaking quietly with Mark. The commissioner's face carried the practiced patience of a man who had handled angry farmers, budget meetings, and election nights. But Harold could see the irritation beneath it. This was supposed to be a clean story. Town comes back. Jobs return. Old building becomes new future. Harold was ruining the picture. Trevor, perhaps sensing the officials watching him, straightened and spoke louder this time. "Mr. Bennett, with respect, the inspection was completed by certified professionals. The component you're concerned about was visually examined, cleaned, lubricated, and tested during dry run. Dry run isn't load. We performed load simulation. Simulation isn't grain." A few heads turned. Trevor's jaw tightened. "The math accounts for live load. The math accounts for what you told it to expect." That brought another laugh, sharper this time. Harold did not raise his voice. That almost made it worse. If he had shouted, they could have dismissed him as emotional. Instead, he stood there in his worn coat and old cap, speaking like a man describing rain while everyone else insisted the sky was clear. Trevor stepped closer. "Can you provide a measurable reading that contradicts the system?" "Yes." Trevor waited. Harold pointed toward the base of the tower. "That safety cable is trembling off rhythm." The service guard pulsed twice when the grain flow thickened. "There's dust falling from the lower seam. And somebody replaced a bolt near that guard without stripping the old paint around it." Trevor stared at him. Then he looked toward the tower despite himself. So did Caleb Morse. The others did not. Mark gave a short breath through his nose. "That is not a measurable reading. It's a machine telling you where to look." "With respect," Mark said, though there was very little respect left in it. "We cannot stop a public reopening because you noticed dust. It isn't the dust." "Then what is it?" "The gear is skipping under load." Trevor shook his head immediately. "You cannot know that from out here." Harold touched the pocket where the brass tooth gauge rested. "I know the rhythm." The laugh this time was louder. Someone near the chairs said, "He knows the rhythm." Another voice added, "Maybe the elevator should ask him permission before it runs." Emily closed her eyes. Harold heard every word. He had spent most of his life pretending such things slid off him. They did not. They entered quietly and stayed there. A man could learn to carry mockery the way he carried old pain in his knees. But carrying it did not mean it weighed nothing. Caleb Morse was no longer smiling. He had moved closer to the service access, pretending to adjust the extension cord. His eyes flicked from the safety cable to the lower siding, then back to Harold. Harold noticed. So did Trevor. "Caleb," Trevor called sharply. "Step away from that area." Caleb froze. "Yes, sir." Mark turned back to Harold. "You need to leave the operating yard. I'm not leaving while grain is moving through that drive. Then we will have security escort you." Emily looked horrified. "Mark, please." But Mark was no longer speaking as Emily's boss or Harold's neighbor. He was speaking as the man responsible for keeping the ceremony from collapsing in front of the county. The truck bed outside the pit lowered empty. Workers began preparing for the second demonstration load. Harold saw the next truck waiting by the road, heavier than the first, its trailer heaped high. The first load had been enough to make the old gear miss. The second might be enough to make it bite wrong, twist, or crack whatever had already been weakened inside that housing. He took one step toward the emergency stop station. Trevor moved in front of him. "Do not touch that panel." Harold's voice went flat. "Then open the lower drive room." "No." It was the first honest word anyone in authority had given him all morning. No. Not because they knew he was wrong, because admitting he might be right would cost them too much in public. The second truck started backing toward the pit. Its reverse alarm cut through the yard in short, steady beeps. Caleb looked down. A thin smear of dark grease had appeared near the drain channel beside the service door. He bent slightly, just enough to see it. Then he looked up at Harold. And for the first time that morning, someone younger than 50 did not look at Harold like a relic. He looked at him like a warning. Harold saw the change in Caleb's face and understood what had to happen next. If the men in charge would not listen to memory, maybe they would listen to evidence. But first, That evidence had to appear before the second load went through. The second truck was heavier than the first. Harold could tell before it reached the pit. The rear tires sat low. The suspension complained over every rut in the gravel. The trailer was heaped with corn, dry and golden under the morning light, beautiful in the way harvest always looked before it became weight, pressure, and force inside a machine. The driver backed slowly toward the grate. Beep, beep, beep. Every sound in the yard seemed too clear now. The reverse alarm. The scrape of boots on gravel. The low murmur of people pretending they had not just watched an old man threaten to stop a public ceremony. The forced confidence in Mark Delaney's voice as he told Commissioner Pike there was no safety issue, only a misunderstanding. Harold did not look at Mark anymore. He looked at the lower siding. Caleb Morse stood near the service door, extension cord still in one hand, eyes lowered toward the dark smear of grease beside the drain channel. He was trying to look busy. Harold recognized the act. Young workers learned it early. If you wanted to notice something dangerous without angering the wrong person, you pretended to be doing another job. The truck stopped. The worker at the pit raised his hand. The bed began to lift. Corn shifted backward with a deep, dry rush. For 3 seconds, the elevator took the load cleanly. Then the first sign came. A yellow light blinked on the control panel behind the glass. Only once. So quickly most people missed it. Trevor did not. His eyes snapped to the screen. His thumb moved fast across the tablet. He frowned, then smoothed his face before anyone important could read it. Harold saw that too. "What was it?" Mark asked quietly. "Minor calibration flag," Trevor said. "Is it clear?" Trevor looked down. It cleared itself. Harold turned his head. "Warnings don't clear themselves. Men clear them, or systems are set to ignore them." Trevor did not answer. The grain flow continued. Then the lights inside the control room flickered. Not the whole building. Not enough to scare the crowd. Just a brief dimming behind the glass, like the elevator had blinked under strain. A worker near the pit looked up. "Power drop?" he asked. Trevor answered too quickly. "No. Normal draw fluctuation." Harold stepped closer to the service door. Mark blocked him again. "Do not start." "I didn't start it," Harold said. "You did." The corn kept pouring. Inside the tower, belts carried grain upward through the leg. Motors hummed. Cups moved. Shafts turned. To the crowd, the sound was loud but ordinary, the sound of work coming back to town. Then came the gap. Half a second. The grain flow stuttered. It was small, but every man who had ever worked harvest knew the difference between steady movement and a throat catching. The corn dropped thin, then heavy again. Somebody near the chairs stopped talking. From behind the lower drive room door came a sound like a hammer tapping once against a pipe. Bang. Not loud. Not catastrophic, but wrong. The kind of sound a machine makes when one piece hits another piece it was never meant to touch. Caleb's face changed. He looked at Harold. Harold did not have to ask if he had heard it. The answer was in the young man's eyes. Trevor moved toward the control room steps. "We're still within range." Harold said, "Range of what?" Trevor kept walking. "Range of what?" Harold repeated. Mark turned sharply. "Enough." "No," Harold said. "Not enough. Not until you tell these men whether your system is reading inside that gear, housing, or around it." That landed harder now. Because the second load had not sounded clean. Because the control room light had flickered. Because the yellow warning had appeared, even if only for a breath. Because Caleb Morse was standing beside the service door with the expression of a young man who had just realized the old man might not be old man wrong. Emily had seen it too. Not the technical details. Not the exact rhythm Harold heard. But she saw the way Trevor avoided the question. She saw Mark's jaw tighten. She saw Caleb look down again at the grease smear near the drain. And for the first time that morning, embarrassment gave way to fear. "Dad," she said, quieter now. Harold heard the change in her voice. He did not look at her. If he did, he might soften, and softening now could get someone hurt. Caleb took one step toward him, keeping his voice low. "Mr. Bennett." Trevor glanced over. "Caleb." The young worker stopped. Then, instead of speaking, he bent, as if adjusting the extension cord. With his body blocking the view from Mark and Trevor, he pointed 2 fingers toward the service door seam. Harold understood. There was a narrow gap under the door where sound leaked from the lower drive room. Not much, but enough for a man who knew what to listen for. Harold moved carefully, not rushing, not giving Mark an excuse to grab him again. He stopped near the wall, leaned one hand against the siding, and bowed his head slightly. The metal vibrated under his palm. He closed his eyes. The whole yard seemed to fall away. The speeches, the cameras, the men laughing, Emily's pleading, Mark's warnings, Trevor's clean numbers. All of it thinned beneath the old language of the machine. There. Skip. Catch. Pull. Skip. But now, there was something else beneath it. A scrape. A hard edge dragging where the tooth should have rolled clean. Harold reached into his pocket and took out the brass tooth gauge. Caleb stared at it. The tool was small, worn, and darkened by years of oil. It did not look impressive. It did not look like something that could challenge a $2.8 million renovation. Harold held it between two fingers and tapped it lightly against the siding. Once. Wait. Again. Wait. Again. Caleb frowned, listening. Harold whispered, "Hear the missing beat?" Caleb swallowed. After a moment, he nodded. Just once. But once was enough. Trevor saw the nod. "What are you doing?" he demanded. Harold opened his eyes. "Teaching him where your report stops." Mark's face hardened. "Step away from that door." Before Harold could answer, the grain flow stuttered again. This time, the sound from inside the lower room was followed by a faint metallic tick that bounced through the drain channel. Caleb looked down. Something small had skittered out with the grease. At first, it looked like a dirty pebble. Caleb crouched, ignoring Trevor's order this time. He picked it up with the corner of a rag and rubbed away the black grease. A thin, curved shaving of metal lay in the cloth, bright on one edge. Fresh. Caleb held it out toward Harold. Nobody in the yard laughed now. Harold looked at the shaving, then at the lower drive-room door. He did not smile. Being right had never felt less like victory. "That," he said quietly, "came off a gear tooth." Trevor stepped closer, color draining from his face. Mark looked toward the crowd, then back at the metal shaving, as if trying to decide whether the truth was small enough to hide. It was not. And for the first time, the question was no longer whether Harold had imagined the sound. The question was how long the company could keep the door closed now that the machine had started leaving pieces of itself on the floor. The metal shaving was no bigger than Harold's thumbnail. For a moment, that smallness worked against him. Mark Delaney stared at it in Caleb's rag as if a problem that tiny could still be explained away. Trevor Hall reached for it, but Caleb pulled his hand back. That was the first time the yard truly changed. A young worker had chosen not to hand the first evidence to the person most eager to dismiss it. Trevor's face tightened. "Caleb, I need to examine that." "Not alone," Harold said. Before Mark could answer, Lila Reyes crossed the gravel from the row of folding chairs. She had been quiet all morning, standing near the county officials with a clipboard against her side. She was the independent safety inspector assigned to observe the reopening, and when she moved now, the ceremony around her seemed to lose its shine. "What is it?" she asked. Caleb opened the rag. Lila bent close. She did not touch the shaving at first. She studied the curve, the fresh, bright edge, and the black grease packed along one side. "Where did you find it?" "By the drain channel near the lower drive room," Caleb said. Trevor stepped in quickly. "We don't know it came from the drive assembly. There's old debris all over this site." Lila looked at him. "Fresh edge." Trevor stopped. Mark forced a careful smile. "Lila, we can't shut down a certified reopening over one shaving." She straightened. "You can, if I say you can." The yard went silent. Not mocking now. Waiting. Lila turned toward the tower. "Pause the demonstration." Mark hesitated just long enough for everyone to see it. "Now," she said. He lifted his radio. "Hold the next load. Shut down intake." The motors began winding down. Belts slowed. Grain settled. The bright, confident hum of the renovated elevator thinned into a silence that felt less like safety than restraint. Emily stood near the control room steps, her hand on the railing. She looked at Harold, expecting maybe anger, maybe satisfaction. There was none. Harold only watched the lower drive room door. He looked like a man waiting for bad news he had already heard once in another lifetime. Lila pointed at the gray steel door. "Open it." Mark said, "We'll need lockout." "Then do it properly." That gave Mark something official to do. Switches were thrown. Tags were clipped. Trevor supervised the sequence with stiff precision. 2 maintenance workers unlocked the lower drive room, and the door scraped open. Warm air rolled out. Old grease. Grain dust, hot iron, new paint over old trouble. For a second, Harold was 29 again, standing behind his father after the 1976 complaint. Then Lila stepped inside, and the present returned. The room looked cleaner than he expected, too clean. The walkway had been swept, warning labels were new, service lights were bright. The cast iron gear housing had been painted dark gray, giving the old part the appearance of something recently approved. Trevor gestured toward it. The housing is intact, no visible fracture, no displacement. Lila crouched by the drain channel. Grease trace, old residue, Trevor said. Harold looked past him. The new bolt was still there, bright against painted older metal. He pointed. Who replaced that? No one answered. Leela looked at Mark. Mark looked at Trevor. Trevor looked at the maintenance workers. That silence became the first real crack in the room. A few minutes earlier, Mark had controlled the yard with smiles and timing. Now even his own crew waited for someone else to tell them what was true. Lila moved her flashlight along the housing. At first, there was only paint, grease, casting marks, and shadow. Trevor's confidence started to return. The component was cleaned and coated during renovation, he said. Superficial irregularities would have been noted. Harold shook his head. You're looking where it sits. Look where it takes the pull, Trevor exhaled. The system is locked out. I didn't say run it. Rotate it by hand. Mark frowned. Is that necessary? Lila answered. Yes. A worker brought the manual turning bar. Caleb stepped forward, but Trevor lifted a hand. I'll do it, Harold said. No, let Caleb. Trevor flushed. He's junior crew. He heard it. That should not have mattered. But after the shaving, the warning light, and the unanswered question about the bolt, it did. Lila looked at Caleb. Lockout confirmed? Yes, ma'am. Rotate slowly. Caleb fitted the bar and pulled. The old gear shifted inside the housing with a deep metal groan. Nothing happened at first. Trevor almost smiled. Then Harold raised one hand. Stop! Caleb froze. Back 2 inches. Caleb eased it back. Now forward. Slow. The gear moved again. Tick. It was not loud, but in the closed room it sounded undeniable. Everyone heard it. Lila's flashlight stopped. Harold pointed near a casting mark half hidden beneath paint and grease. There. Lila wiped the spot with a cloth. Paint smeared. Grease came away. Raised numbers emerged from the old iron. E. Beside the stamp was a line so thin it looked like a scratch. She changed the angle of the light. The line caught silver. Not a scratch. A hairline crack. Trevor said nothing. Mark stepped closer, then stopped. Lila touched the edge with a small pick. Document this. No one moved. Now. Caleb took photos with shaking hands. Trevor raised his tablet more slowly, as if the screen had become unfamiliar. Emily stood in the doorway, pale. Harold looked at the crack and felt no victory. The old gear had not been silent. It had been patient. Then Lila wiped farther along the housing. Her cloth caught on a small round mark drilled into the metal near the end of the crack. She wiped again. Another drilled mark appeared. A stop drill. Old. Covered later with grease and paint. Lila looked at Harold. A crack could be missed. A stop drill meant someone had seen it before. Someone had known. Harold's hand closed around the brass tooth gauge in his pocket. For nearly 50 years, people had treated his father's warning like bitterness, pride, or an old mechanic's fear. But under fresh paint and a $2.8 million renovation, the machine had carried proof. Lila stood. This system stays shut down. This, Mark started to speak. And I want every archived maintenance record connected to this assembly, she added. At that, Mark's face changed. Not because of the crack. Because of the records. Harold saw it clearly. The gear had finally shown them the first wound. Now the next question was worse. Who had covered it, and how far back did the lie go? Mark Delaney's first instinct was not to lie. It was to shrink the truth until it fit inside a sentence people could survive. By the time everyone stepped out of the lower drive room, he already had the phrase ready. Temporary maintenance delay. He said it first to Commissioner Pike, then to the company representative, then to the local reporter who had been waiting near the chairs with her camera lowered but not turned off. Just a temporary maintenance delay, Mark repeated. We found a component that needs further review before we proceed. That's why we have safety protocols. It sounded responsible. It also sounded clean. Too clean. Harold stood near the service door and watched the words do what fresh paint had done to the old gear. Cover the damage, smooth the surface, make the problem look smaller than it was. Lila Reyes did not argue with Mark in front of the crowd. She simply wrote something on her clipboard and told the nearest worker to keep the intake shut down until further notice. That phrase traveled faster than Mark's. Until further notice. The workers heard it. The farmers heard it. Emily heard it from the control room steps and felt something cold move through her chest. This was no longer her father embarrassing her. This was no longer an old argument escaping into a public place. The elevator was shut down because Harold had been right. Trevor Hall stood beside the control panel, staring at the photos Caleb had taken. His face was tight, not with fear exactly, but with the anger of a man whose confidence had been struck in public. The certification wasn't wrong, he said. Nobody answered. So he said it again, louder. The certification was based on available inspection criteria. If there was concealed damage under paint and grease, that is a documentation issue, not an engineering failure. Harold looked at him. Trevor hated that look. It was not smug. It was worse. Patient. You certified a machine you didn't fully understand, Harold said. Trevor's mouth opened, but nothing useful came out. Mark stepped in quickly. We are not assigning blame in the yard. No, Lila said, walking toward them. We're preserving evidence. That stopped him. Evidence was a heavier word than delay. Caleb Morse still held the rag with the metal shaving inside it. He looked as if he wanted to put it down and wash his hands, but Lila had already told him not to lose it. A supervisor from the maintenance crew pulled Caleb aside near the scale house. Harold could not hear every word, but he did not need to. He saw the pointed finger. He saw Caleb's shoulders tighten. He saw the young man glance once toward the lower drive room, then toward Harold, as if realizing that telling the truth could cost more than he had imagined. Harold started toward them. Emily caught his sleeve. Not to stop him this time. To steady him. Let me, she said. He looked at her, surprised. Emily crossed the gravel before she could lose her nerve. The maintenance supervisor lowered his voice when she approached, but she heard enough. You were told to stay clear of restricted access, he said to Caleb. You involved an unauthorized person in active operations. Caleb's face had gone pale. I found metal near the drain. You created a scene. Emily stepped beside Caleb. He reported a safety concern. The supervisor looked at her. This isn't payroll, Emily. No, she said. It's liability. That word made him pause. Emily had spent years thinking her father lived too much in old wounds, but she had also spent enough time in office work to know which words made companies careful. Liability was one of them. She looked toward Mark, then Trevor, then the lower drive room. If anyone disciplines Caleb for preserving evidence after an inspector-ordered shutdown, I want that instruction in writing. The supervisor said nothing. Caleb looked at her like she had just opened a door he had not known existed. Across the yard, Commissioner Pike was speaking into his phone with his back turned to the workers. His voice stayed low, but frustration sharpened every gesture. The reopening was supposed to be a victory, a speech, a photograph, a promise fulfilled before noon. Now the chairs sat empty. The ribbons sagged across the gate, and the first thing the town had seen from its $2.8 million renovation was a shutdown. Mark approached Lila with a folder in his hand. We can provide current renovation documents, he said. Inspection sheets, contractor reports, replacement logs. I want archived maintenance records connected to the lower drive assembly, Lila said. Mark's face tightened. The facility changed ownership twice. Some older records may not be complete. Then we'll start with what exists. Trevor inserted himself into the conversation. A stop drill could have been part of an older stabilization procedure. That doesn't prove concealment. No, Lila said. It proves prior knowledge of a crack. Not necessarily unsafe operation. Harold spoke quietly. Why drill the end of a crack you don't think matters? Trevor looked away. Emily heard that too. Something in her shifted again. She had spent all morning protecting her job from her father. Now she found herself protecting the truth from the people who signed her checks. And she remembered something. Not from 1,976. From 3 weeks ago. A budget spreadsheet. A renovation cost variance. A line item she had been asked to recode from drive assembly replacement review to historic component surface restoration. At the time, she had not questioned it. Office work was full of strange categories. Managers liked clean language. Contractors liked tidy invoices. Now the words felt different. Historic component surface restoration. Not replacement. Not repair. Surface. Emily walked quickly to the office. Harold watched her go, unsure whether she was leaving him or helping him. She returned 5 minutes later with a printed sheet folded in her hand. Her voice was not loud when she spoke to Lila, but it was steady. "You should see this." Mark turned. "Emily." She did not look at him. She handed the page to Lila. "There was a replacement review in the budget," Emily said. "It was removed before final approval. The line was reclassified." Trevor's face changed. Mark's did not. That was worse. Lila read the sheet, then looked toward the office building. "Where are the archive files stored?" Emily pointed past the scale house. "Basement file room. Some boxes were moved there after the renovation." Mark stepped forward. "Those records are disorganized. We should have counsel present before." Lila cut him off. "You can call counsel from the basement." No one laughed. They went inside through the side entrance. Lila first, then Emily, Mark, Trevor, Harold, and Caleb, who followed only after Harold nodded for him to come. The basement smelled of cardboard, damp concrete, and old paper. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Boxes lined metal shelves, labeled by year, vendor, insurance category, and equipment type. For 20 minutes, they found nothing useful. Then Emily pulled a box from a lower shelf and wiped dust from the lid. The label was faded, not typed, handwritten. Bennett rejected maintenance complaint. Harold stopped breathing for a moment. The room seemed to tilt backward through 50 years. Lila looked at him, then at the box. "Is Bennett your family name?" Harold's voice came out rough. "Yes." Emily stared at the label, and for the first time in her life, the old shadow her father carried had a shape. Lila reached for the lid, and Harold knew that whatever lay inside would not just explain the cracked gear. It would explain why his father had spent the rest of his life listening to a warning no one else wanted to hear. Lila Reyes did not open the box immediately. She placed it on the basement table and stood over it for a moment, reading the faded handwriting on the lid. Bennett rejected maintenance complaint. The words seemed too small for what they carried. Harold stood beside Emily, his hands hanging at his sides. For most of his life, his father's story had existed in fragments. A warning, a lost job, a town that looked away, a bitterness nobody wanted at the dinner table. Now the fragments had a label. Emily looked at the box, then at her father. She wanted to say something, but no apology felt large enough yet. Lila cut the old tape with a pocket knife. Inside were folders, carbon copies, yellowed inspection sheets, handwritten notes, and one brown envelope tied with string. The top folder had Charles Bennett's name typed across it. Harold saw the date before anything else. The 18th of October, 1976. He reached for the table but did not touch the paper. Lila opened the folder carefully. The first page was a maintenance complaint written in Charles Bennett's plain, careful language. It named the lower drive assembly. It identified the 1,938 gear housing. It described irregular load behavior after the seasonal expansion. It warned that the component had not been designed for the increased volume Prairie Crown was pushing through it. Charles had not been vague. He had not guessed. He had written measurements, conditions, dates, temperatures, and exact operating circumstances. He described a skipped tooth pattern under heavy grain flow. He recommended immediate shutdown until the assembly could be replaced. Not patched, not watched, replaced. Trevor Hall stood across the table, his arms folded tightly. At first, he read with the guarded face of a man looking for a technical weakness. Then he found none. His arms lowered. Mark Delaney stood near the basement steps, pale and silent. Lila turned to the second page. It was a response from management. Rejected. The reason given was almost polite. Insufficient evidence of immediate failure risk. Harold let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. Insufficient, he said. Lila kept reading. The next pages showed internal notes. One supervisor had written that Charles Bennett was overly cautious and emotionally attached to outdated maintenance practices. Another note said a shutdown would jeopardize a grain contract large enough to affect winter staffing. Then came the line that made Emily cover her mouth. Recommendation: remove Bennett from lead maintenance authority, pending attitude review. Harold closed his eyes. He had known the shape of it. He had not known the cruelty had been typed so neatly. Lila opened the brown envelope. Inside was a signed statement. Charles Bennett's signature was at the bottom. For a moment, Harold did not understand what he was seeing. The paper said Charles had withdrawn his complaint. It said he accepted that his assessment may have been influenced by excessive caution. It said he agreed the company had acted within reasonable safety judgment. "That's not him," Harold said. His voice was flat. Emily looked at the signature. "Dad, that is his hand," Harold said, "but those are not his words." Lila found another sheet behind it. A private memo. She read silently first. Then her face changed. "What?" Emily asked. Lila looked at Harold. "Your mother was receiving health coverage through the company plan at the time?" Harold stared at her. The room seemed to lose air. "Yes." Lila placed the memo on the table. It was from a company administrator to the plant manager. It said that if Charles Bennett continued to pursue the complaint, his employment separation would be classified as disciplinary rather than voluntary restructuring. That classification could affect continuation of dependent medical benefits. Emily read the sentence twice before she understood it. They threatened Grandma's health insurance? No one answered. No one had to. Harold stepped back as if the floor had shifted beneath him. All those years, he had believed his father came home quiet because he had been defeated, because the company had made him small, because the town had taken his name and turned it into a warning about causing trouble. But Charles had not signed because he stopped believing the machine. He signed because his wife was sick. He traded his own name for the chance to keep her covered a little longer. The brass tooth gauge in Harold's pocket suddenly felt heavier than metal. Emily began to cry without making a sound. For the first time, she understood that the shadow she had spent her life resenting was not stubbornness. It was sacrifice. Buried so completely that even the family it protected had mistaken it for bitterness. Lila continued through the folder. There was more. A list of 5 workers who had initially signed witness notes confirming they had heard irregular movement in the lower drive room during heavy load. Beside, 3 names were later withdrawal forms. One man wrote that he could not be certain. Another claimed he had misheard ordinary vibration. The third statement had no explanation, only a signature. Harold recognized 2 of the names. Men who had eaten at his mother's table. Men who had told Charles in private that he was right. He did not blame them as quickly as he expected to. That surprised him. At 29, he would have called them cowards. At 79, he understood winter, children, mortgages, sick wives, and the quiet terror of losing a paycheck in a town with nowhere else to go. The lie had not survived because one villain held it up. It survived because too many frightened people had each carried a small corner of it. Mark finally spoke. "My company didn't own Prairie Crown then." Lila looked at him. "No. But your renovation retained the assembly, painted over the housing, and reclassified a replacement review as surface restoration." Mark swallowed. "I didn't know about this file." Harold looked at him. "But you knew where not to look." That landed. Mark had no answer. Trevor sat down on the edge of a metal chair, staring at the 1976 report. His face no longer carried pride. It carried the first heavy signs of shame. "I trusted the documentation," he said quietly. Harold looked at him. "So did the men who ignored my father." The room went still. For a moment, Harold felt the old anger rise. It came up hot and familiar. He could demand everything now. He could ask Lila to shut the project down indefinitely. He could push the reporter toward the basement and let the story burn through the town by evening. He could make every official, every manager, every engineer feel the humiliation Charles had carried home in a lunch pail. Part of him wanted that. A tired, honest part. Then he looked at Caleb. The young man stood near the shelf, silent, frightened, still holding the rag that had started the truth moving. Harold thought of the workers outside. Men and women who needed the elevator open, but safe. Farmers who needed a local place to haul grain. Emily, who needed a job that did not require betraying herself. Trevor, young enough to learn if pride did not ruin him first. And he thought of Charles. His father had not filed that report to win an argument. He had filed it so no one would get hurt. Harold touched the folder with 2 fingers. "I want it public," he said. Mark's head lifted. "But I don't want this town punished for what scared men buried 50 years ago. Replace the assembly. Not patch it, not paint it. Replace it. Protect Caleb. Keep every worker paid during shutdown. put my father's report in the training room where every engineer who comes through here has to read it. Lila studied him. And the certification? Withdraw it, Harold said, looking at Trevor. Then earn a new one. Trevor lowered his eyes. Emily wiped her face and stood straighter. I can pull the cost records, she said. All of them. Mark looked at her, but this time, he did not tell her to stop. The box stayed open on the table. The truth had finally been given air, but air was only the beginning. By afternoon, the workers would know, the farmers would know, the county would know. And every person who had laughed at Harold Bennett would have to decide what kind of apology meant anything after 50 years of silence. By early afternoon, nobody was sitting in the folding chairs anymore. The ribbon still hung across the gate, but it no longer looked like a symbol of celebration. It looked like something waiting to be cut only after the town had earned the right to cut it. Workers stood in small groups near the scale house. Farmers leaned against their trucks. The local reporter waited quietly, camera down, as if even she understood that this was no longer a simple story about a delayed reopening. When Lila Reyes came out of the office with the 1976 report copied and logged, she did not make a speech. She handed one copy to Mark Delaney, one to Trevor Hall, one to Commissioner Pike, and one to Harold Bennett. The original stayed in her evidence folder. Mark looked at the paper like it weighed more than the entire elevator. Commissioner Pike cleared his throat, but for once, the public man had no ready sentence. His prepared remarks about progress, investment, and rural renewal were still folded in his coat pocket. They belonged to a version of the day that no longer existed. Trevor was the first to move. He walked to the control room, removed the certification sheet from the display board, and laid it flat on the desk. Then he took a pen from his shirt pocket and wrote across the top, "Withdrawn pending full mechanical replacement and safety review." He signed his name beneath it. No one told him to do it. That was why it mattered. When he came back outside, his face was pale, but his voice was steady. "I certified what I thought I understood," Trevor said. That was not enough. The words carried across the yard. Some of the workers looked down. A few farmers exchanged glances. Caleb stood near Harold, still unsure where to put his hands. Trevor turned to Caleb. "You were right not to hand me that shaving without a witness," he said. "I would have called it debris before I was ready to see what it was." Caleb swallowed. "I didn't want anybody getting hurt." "I know. That was not a full apology, but it was a beginning." Mark Delaney took longer. He stood near the gate, staring at the ground where the demonstration trucks had left tire marks. Harold could see the fight inside him. Mark was not a cartoon villain. He had wanted the elevator open because the town needed it. He had wanted jobs, trucks, payroll, movement, proof that Prairie Crown was not dead. But wanting a good thing had made him willing to ignore a dangerous one. Finally, Mark walked over to Harold. "I should have stopped it when you asked," he said. Harold did not answer right away. Mark looked toward the lower drive room. "I thought if we let one concern slow everything down, the whole project might fall apart." "It almost did," Harold said. "Just not the way you meant." Mark nodded once, accepting the hit. "I'll recommend paid shutdown for the crew until the replacement is complete," he said. "No one loses wages because we got this wrong. Caleb keeps his job, and the assembly gets replaced, not patched." Harold studied him. "Put it in writing." Mark gave a tired breath. "I will." Emily stood a few steps away, holding the cost records against her chest. She had spent the last hour pulling files, printing copies, and answering Lila's questions. Work had given her something to do while her heart caught up with what she had learned. Now, there was nothing left between her and her father except the apology she had been avoiding since the basement. She walked to him slowly. "Dad." Harold turned. For a moment, she looked very young to him. Not 46. Not the woman with a desk by the window and bills waiting at home. Just his daughter, standing in the shadow of the same building that had hurt 3 generations of Bennetts in 3 different ways. "I thought you were dragging us backward," Emily said. "I thought you were holding on to something because you couldn't let it go." Harold's face softened, but he did not rescue her from the words. She needed to say them. "I didn't understand what Grandpa gave up," she continued. "I didn't understand what you were carrying. And this morning when you tried to stop them, I was more worried about being embarrassed than about why you were scared." Her voice broke then. "I'm sorry." Harold looked at the woman she had become, and the child she had been, both standing in front of him at once. Then he reached out and put one rough hand on her shoulder. "You didn't know," he said. "I should have listened." He shook his head. "We all should have. That was as close as Harold Bennett came to forgiving the whole world in one sentence. Commissioner Pike finally found his public voice, though it sounded different now. He announced that the county would hold an open safety review before operations resumed. The company would file a replacement plan. Workers would remain paid during the shutdown. Lila Reyes would oversee the reinspection. The old 1,938 gear would be removed, preserved, and documented instead of quietly scrapped. Then Harold asked for one more thing. Not loudly, not dramatically, but everyone heard it. "The report stays here," he said. "A copy of my father's report goes in the training room, not hidden in a file box, not summarized in a memo. The whole thing, his name, his warning, and what it cost him." Trevor looked up. Mark nodded. Pike nodded too, this time without trying to make it sound like his idea. "And every engineer who certifies this place," Harold said, "reads it before they sign anything." Trevor stepped closer. "Would you help build that training?" he asked. The yard went still again, but this silence was different. Harold looked at the young engineer who had laughed without laughing, dismissed without listening, and then signed his own correction when the truth became undeniable. "What do you want me to teach?" Harold asked. Trevor glanced toward the tower. "How to hear what the screen can't." Harold almost smiled. Almost. Behind him, Caleb looked at the lower drive room with a different expression now. Not fear. Not shame. Attention. That mattered to Harold more than the apology. Because an apology ended something. Attention began something. As the workers started clearing the yard and the reporter prepared to tell the town what had really happened, Harold looked up at Prairie Crown. The elevator was silent now, but for the first time all day, the silence did not feel like concealment. It felt like waiting. The next time that machine ran, it would not run on fresh paint and buried warnings. It would run only after the old lie had been removed from its heart. And what came after that would decide whether Charles Bennett's name remained a wound or became the lesson that kept another generation safe. 6 months later, Prairie Crown Grain Elevator opened again. There was no ribbon stretched across the gate this time. No county speech printed on thick paper. No camera crew waiting for a clean story about progress. The reopening happened on a cold morning in early spring, with frost still silver on the gravel and the sky pale over the empty fields. A few workers arrived before sunrise. Farmers came in slowly, not because anyone had invited them, but because people in small towns know when something that once went wrong is trying to become right again. The new lower drive assembly had been installed in January, not patched, not coded, not described with clean language that hid what mattered. Replaced. Lila Reyes had signed the final safety review only after the system had been tested under real load, with the covers open during controlled inspection and every vibration point documented. Trevor Hall signed the new certification beneath hers, but he did not display it alone behind glass. Beside it, in the new training room, was another document. Charles Bennett's 1976 maintenance complaint. The full report. Not a summary. Not a softened version. Not a paragraph about historic safety awareness. His name was there, his measurements were there, his warning was there. So was the record of what had happened after he gave it. Harold stood in that room the first morning it opened and stared at the page longer than anyone expected. Emily stood beside him. She did not rush him. She had learned that some silences were not empty. Some silences were rooms finally making space for what had been pushed out of them. The old 1938 gear housing sat behind glass on the opposite wall. It had been cleaned but not polished too much. The hairline crack remained visible. So did the stop drill marks. A small light shone across the raised stamp, "Ye." Below it, a simple plaque read, "This gear did not fail without warning." The warning was ignored. Safety begins with listening. Harold had not chosen the wording. Trevor had. When Harold first saw it, he only nodded once. For Trevor, that felt like more than forgiveness. It felt like permission to become better. The training room became part of every orientation after that. New workers came through before stepping onto the operating floor. Engineers read the Bennett report before reviewing sensor data. Maintenance apprentices were shown the cracked housing before they were shown the new control panel. And once a week, Harold came in. He never called it teaching. He called it listening practice. He would stand with a small group of workers near the lower drive room while the elevator ran under controlled load. He showed them how to tell the difference between a belt settling and a belt fighting. He taught them where to place a hand on a railing without getting careless. He made them close their eyes and identify which vibration belonged to the frame, which belonged to the motor, and which did not belong at all. Screens matter, he told them. But screens only report what somebody thought to measure. Caleb Morse listened harder than anyone. He had stayed at Prairie Crown. Mark kept his promise. No wages were lost during the shutdown, and Caleb was not disciplined. In fact, he was promoted into the maintenance training track by summer. The first time Caleb correctly identified a bearing starting to run hot before the sensor flagged it, Harold said nothing at first. He only handed him the brass tooth gauge. Caleb held it like something fragile. "I can't take this," he said. "I didn't say keep it," Harold answered. "I said use it." From the office window, Emily watched them. She still worked payroll. She still kept records. But the desk by the window no longer felt like a place where she had to choose between her future and her father's past. She became the person who made sure every inspection note was filed where it could be found, not buried where it could be forgotten. Mark Delaney changed too, though not all at once. He still cared about deadlines. He still worried about budgets. But after the shutdown, he stopped treating caution like an enemy of progress. When a worker raised a concern, Mark no longer asked how long it would delay operations. He asked who needed to look at it. Commissioner Pike came back only once, months after the reopening. He stood in the training room, read Charles Bennett's report, and stayed quiet longer than public men usually like to stay quiet. Before leaving, he asked Emily if the county could help fund a scholarship for rural mechanical trades. She said yes. Harold did not attend the announcement. He had never cared much for ceremonies. But one evening near the end of harvest, he came to Prairie Crown after most of the trucks had gone. The air was cool. Dust hung gold in the low sun. The elevator ran steady against the sky. Not loud, not strained, just working. Emily found him standing near the fence. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then she said, "What do you hear?" Harold kept his eyes on the tower. He listened to the motors, the belts, the new lower drive, the grain moving clean through the system. No skip, no hidden catch, no old warning trapped beneath paint. Just rhythm. For the first time in nearly 50 years, Prairie Crown did not sound like the day his father had been ignored. It sounded like the day someone finally listened. Harold reached into his coat pocket, touched the empty place where the brass tooth gauge used to rest, and smiled faintly. Not because the past had been fixed. Some things cannot be fixed. But they can be named. They can be taught. They can be placed behind glass where no one has to pretend they never happened. The elevator kept running after the sun went down. Steady, patient. And this time, the old machine was not asking to be heard. It already had been.